Section 12. Who do you represent? Customer or client, or no representation? That is the question. Throughout this course, we've discussed when agency begins, how implied agency develops, and why timely disclosure is one of the best ways to protect both the consumer and the licensee. Now let's apply those concepts to one of the areas that causes the most confusion for Arizona real estate professionals: completing the agency sections of Arizona purchase contracts and lease agreements. Even experienced agents occasionally pause when they reach the agency section of a contract and ask themselves, exactly who do I represent in this transaction? The answer should never be a surprise. If you've had the agency conversation at the appropriate time and properly completed the necessary disclosures, completing the contract becomes much easier. Let's look at a common Arizona example. Imagine you're holding an open house for one of your listings. Your designated broker has instructed the office that when hosting your own listings, you are not to act as a limited dual agent. If an unrepresented buyer wants to purchase the property, you are to continue representing only the seller. Late in the afternoon, a young couple walks through the front door. They love the home. After touring the property, they ask, "We'd like to buy it. Can you help us?" At that moment, your agency discussion begins. You explain that you already represent the seller and that, consistent with your brokerage's policy, you will continue to represent only the seller if they choose to submit an offer. You carefully explain what that means, answer their questions, and present the Arizona READE form. The buyers acknowledge that you represent only the seller by completing the appropriate election on the READE form. They also review and sign the unrepresented buyer disclosure, confirming they understand that you are not acting as their agent. Only after that discussion do you begin preparing the purchase contract. Everything is proceeding smoothly until you reach the agency section of the contract. Many agents suddenly hesitate. If this buyer is unrepresented, should I leave the agency section blank? The answer is generally no, although your designated broker's office policies should always control how brokerage forms are completed. Most Arizona brokers recommend completing the brokerage information while clearly indicating that the buyer is unrepresented and checking the appropriate box showing that you represent the seller only. Leaving those sections blank can create unnecessary confusion for escrow officers, brokers, attorneys, auditors, or anyone reviewing the file months or even years later. A complete contract tells the entire story of the transaction. Remember, completing the brokerage information does not automatically mean you represent the buyer. It simply identifies the brokers participating in the transaction and documents each party's role. This same concept applies whether you're using the Arizona Residential Resale Purchase Contract, Residential Lease Agreement, Vacant Land Contract, or many commercial purchase contracts. Consistency creates clarity. Working with a for sale by owner. Now let's look at another situation that many agents eventually encounter. You've been representing a buyer for several weeks. You've already completed your agency disclosures, and your buyer has signed the Buyer-Broker Exclusive Employment Agreement, BBEEA. One afternoon, your buyer says, "I found a for sale by owner online. Can we go look at it?" Absolutely, but don't skip an important step. Before scheduling the showing, contact the owner. Introduce yourself and explain that you exclusively represent the buyer. Then discuss whether the seller is willing to compensate your brokerage if a sale occurs. If compensation is agreed upon, document the arrangement before showing the property. Many Arizona brokers use either an internally approved agreement or the Arizona Association of Realtors Unrepresented Seller Compensation Agreement for this purpose. That document accomplishes two important objectives. First, it clearly informs the seller that you represent the buyer, not them. Second, it establishes how your brokerage will be compensated if the transaction closes. Only after those discussions have occurred should you proceed with the showing. Clear communication early in the process prevents misunderstandings later. When is the right time to discuss agency? Let's revisit another real-life situation. Several months ago, you listed a beautiful home. The seller completed the READ form and authorized both seller representation and limited dual representation. A few weeks later, a couple calls after seeing your yard sign. You meet them at the property. They absolutely love the home. They spend nearly an hour asking questions, walking through every room, discussing financing, and talking about writing an offer. As they're leaving, they tell you they'll return tomorrow with family members before making a final decision. Driving back to your office, it suddenly hits you. You never discussed agency. So when should that conversation have occurred? Should it have happened while they were still on the phone? Probably not. At that point, they were simply requesting information about a property. Should you have handed them paperwork before they even walked through the front door? Again, probably not. They hadn't yet asked for your professional services or engaged in a meaningful agency discussion. The appropriate time occurs after you've established a working relationship, but before they begin relying on your advice or asking you to help them purchase the property. Once they begin seeking your professional assistance, explain the available agency relationships, answer their questions, and complete the appropriate disclosures before moving forward. Waiting until you're writing the purchase contract is simply too late. At that point, an implied agency relationship may already exist. Agency disclosure protects everyone. Some new licensees mistakenly believe agency disclosure exists primarily to protect the real estate agent. In reality, its primary purpose is to protect the consumer. The READ form allows buyers and sellers to understand exactly who represents whom before important decisions are made. It reduces confusion. It prevents implied agency. It encourages informed decision-making. It helps consumers understand the duties owed to clients versus customers. Most importantly, it creates transparency. Consumers should never have to guess whether a licensee is representing them. Likewise, licensees should never have to guess who they represent. When agency is discussed early, documented properly, and consistently reinforced throughout the transaction, everyone benefits. As you've probably noticed throughout this course, the paperwork itself is not the goal. The conversation is. The forms simply document the conversation that should already have taken place. Professional agency disclosure isn't about checking boxes. It's about building trust through honesty, communication, and clear expectations from the very beginning. Online discussion question 1. Why is it important to discuss agency before preparing an offer, rather than waiting until contract writing? Answer. Discussing agency early allows the consumer to understand who represents whom before relying on the licensee's advice. Waiting until the offer is written can create confusion and may even result in an implied agency relationship. Why is it considered a best practice to complete the agency section of the purchase contract rather than leaving it blank? Answer. A complete contract clearly documents each broker's role and reduces confusion for brokers, escrow officers, auditors, and others who may review the transaction file later. Proper documentation also demonstrates professionalism and reduces misunderstandings. Question 3. What is the primary purpose of the READ form? Answer. The READ form is designed to educate consumers about agency relationships, allow them to make informed decisions regarding representation, and help prevent implied agency by documenting the agency relationship from the beginning.